In February 1990, James Baker met with Mikhail Gorbachev in Moscow. Germany was moving toward reunification. Soviet troops were still stationed in East Germany. The question on the table was what happened to NATO if Germany became one country again. Baker told Gorbachev that NATO would not move east. Not 1 inch, he said. After the meeting, Baker put the exchange in writing. He sent a written summary back to the U.S. State Department in Washington, describing what had been said in the room and how the U.S. position had been presented to the Soviet leadership. Around the same time, Baker sent a separate letter to West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl. In it, he again described the assurances that had been conveyed to Moscow about NATO's future movement. The Soviet side kept its own records. German officials kept theirs. None of them described confusion about what had been communicated. Germany reunified. Soviet forces withdrew. Years later, NATO began moving east. What had been said was on the record, and it stayed there. In 1990, Russia wasn't negotiating from strength. The Soviet Union was coming apart. The economy was collapsing faster than anyone could stabilize it. Power was draining out of institutions in real time. This wasn't a country in a position to demand written guarantees. What it had instead were conversations. Understandings reached in rooms where the future was still being improvised. That's why the language mattered. At that moment, there was no clear post-Cold War security structure. NATO remained intact. The Warsaw Pact still existed on paper, but member states were already pulling away and ignoring its command. Treaties take time. They require leverage. They assume stability on both sides. Russia didn't have that. What Russia had were Western officials telling Moscow what NATO would do and what it wouldn't. Soviet troops didn't just leave Germany. They left Eastern Europe altogether. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers withdrew. Bases were abandoned. Equipment was scrapped. Once those troops moved, there was no easy way back. Where NATO stopped mattered on the map, not because of ideology, because of proximity. Once those troops were gone, there was no mechanism to reverse it, no leverage left to trade, no position to renegotiate. By the time Russia stabilized, the conversation had moved on. What had once been spoken assurances became historical footnotes. There was nothing to enforce what had been said by Baker and others. For a time, NATO expansion was described as theoretical, something discussed in broad terms, not a decision. That language didn't last. By the mid-1990s, the phrasing inside Western institutions began to change. Internal documents stopped asking whether NATO would expand and started outlining how it could. Soon, officers from countries outside NATO were sitting in NATO rooms. They attended briefings and trained alongside NATO units. This wasn't membership, but it wasn't distance either. NATO planning no longer stopped at the alliance's existing borders. Once that started, the separation was already gone. Stopping it would have meant undoing relationships that were already operating as if the decision had been made. At the same time, objections to expand NATO didn't disappear. They faded. In 1997, George Kennan warned publicly that NATO expansion would provoke a reaction in Russia and undo what little stability had been built after the Cold War. But those warnings no longer stopped anything. He was ignored. Once joint planning began between NATO and militaries from non-member states, shared exercises, shared procedures, there was no clean way to stop it. Reversing it would have required someone to step in and halt what was already underway. No one did. By the time new members were formally admitted, the decision had effectively been made years earlier. By then, it was already in motion. For years, expansion only existed on paper. Then it showed up on the map. New members didn't just sign documents, they opened airspace. They aligned infrastructure. Military planning adjusted to new borders. What had once been a buffer became a line. The change showed up on the map. The space between NATO forces and Russian territory narrowed. Air patrol patterns adjusted and radar coverage followed the new borders as training activity moved closer. None of this required an announcement. It followed naturally from membership. Once those borders moved, they didn't move back. There was no mechanism to restore the old maps. From that point on, the security Russia had been told to expect no longer existed.